Hi, everyone, and welcome out here to Nautilus Live. We're so excited to have you joining us. My name is Megan Cook. I'm the Director of Education and Outreach with Ocean Exploration Trust, where I have the privilege of having a role where I get to share inspiring ocean stories with the world. This is the fourth in our series of From Shore to the Abyss project panels, which are chances for you to talk with our team on board from the National Geographic Society and the Ocean Exploration Trust. Wherever you are watching from, whether that is on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on Facebook, on nautiluslive.org, we're so glad that you are here. Throughout the program today, you'll have the opportunity to get your questions and comments into the program by just dropping it down into the comments in that platform, and we'll pull them in for our speakers. This is a really exciting expedition. We are underway here in the Central Pacific in Moana Nui Akea, and we are so glad to welcome you aboard the ship to join in this experience. We're calling these expeditions From Shore to the Abyss, where we bring our expertise, where you generally know us from, offshore in the deep waters, up to the shallow ocean, where we can work together with teams from National Geographic Society and to contribute that new knowledge in service of communities, in service of conservation, education, and ocean exploration for the future. I'm really excited for today's conversation. We're going to talk about expeditions and what brings us all together here. And to start that conversation, we'll throw it over to Jennifer Berglund. She is a storyteller, a journalist. Her beautiful work has been featured in national and international news. And today, she is here on board with us as the storytelling lead for the Malama Mano project here on Nautilus. So over to you, Jenny. Let's get started.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was so nice. Before we get started, I want to begin by acknowledging that the Pacific Ocean, the Aina, on which we gather, is part of the larger territory recognized by Indigenous Hawaiians as their ancestral lands, Papahanaumoku. We acknowledge that Hawaiians have stewarded through generations the ocean, seas, coastlines, and lands of what is now the Pacific Ocean. We honor and respect the enduring deep relations and interconnectedness that exists between these peoples, the ocean, and the environment. So we have a really exciting show today, but before we get started, I want to start out with a question for you all, our audience, to ponder. If you had a ship like the Nautilus, or a Polynesian double-hulled voyaging canoe, or a va'a, what or who would you bring on board with you? So think about that for a minute and please type in your questions or your answers. So we have a really exciting show today, as I was saying, with three incredible guests. First, we'll hear from Ingrid Algren, the curator of oceanic collections at the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University, followed by Allison Fundis, the chief operating officer of the Ocean Exploration Trust, sitting right next to me. Which operates this vessel, the EV Nautilus. And finally, we'll hear from Elizabeth Lindsay, the first Polynesian National Geographic explorer and the first National Geographic fellow. Just wow.
Female.
Oh, female National Geographic fellow, excuse me.
Men in the past.
Yeah, that's true. That's part of this conversation. Stay tuned for the full hour to hear from each of them, and please ask questions. We're so excited to hear from you. Our amazing guests today have spent many years studying and thinking about ocean expeditions of the past, present, and future. As we learn from them, I challenge you to reflect on not just the discoveries made, but the lens through which these discoveries are interpreted, and how that lens colors our understanding of the world and its many great mysteries. Kicking off this conversation is Ingrid Algren, the curator of oceanic collections at the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University, and a research associate at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. Her research investigates the intersections of oceanic identity, environment, cultural resources, and she is committed to increasing access to museum collections. She's joining us virtually from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Hi, Ingrid. Tell us a bit about your work at the museum and how you became interested in the history of Pacific islands like Hawaii.
Hi, Jenny. Hello, everyone out there. What a distinct honor. I'm so excited to be part of this panel of women. So thank you very much for inviting me, Jenny, and everyone there. I want to begin, of course, by also myself coming from Massachusetts here. I also first, before I get going, want to make sure that I acknowledge that I am an uninvited guest. I'm here on the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people, and I absolutely want to send along my honor and respect and gratitude for their stewardship of the lands and waters for millennia before I came here. So Jenny, you wanted to know how I got interested in the Pacific Islands. And for me, that's a very personal question. Oddly enough, it's not just an academic endeavor. I was born and raised as a white American in the Republic of the Marshall Islands in the atoll called Kwajalein. And Kwajalin's kind of this interesting place. I was there till I was about 13 years old. And even though the Republic of the Marshall Islands is a sovereign, independent nation of indigenous Marshallese people that have been there for 3,000 years or longer, there's this space called Kwajalein, which has the largest lagoon in the world. And that's where I grew up. The United States has an agreement with the Marshall Islands to lease out the land for this military base here. And that's why I was there. And it's an interesting place, though, for those of you that are older on this video might remember the Star Wars program, Ronald Reagan, which is basically send a missile from California, try and shoot it down with a missile from the Marshall Islands, right? It's called intercontinental ballistic missiles. It's come up in the news a lot lately, actually, because of some of the things happening in North Korea. But that's why my family was there, right? And as I got older, I started to think about, I'm living in this military base. It's like 1,000 Americans on this base. And all around me is this incredible place full of Marshallese people. And I was like, why am I here? I didn't really fully comprehend what the heck I was doing there and why the United States was there and why it was doing its science, its testing and its research. Why was it happening out there in the Pacific, right? In this independent nation. And so that really spurred my interest in history and anthropology and really sent me down the path that I am today. And it's had me really ponder about this legacy of contact with the Pacific, particularly by foreigners and Westerners. And thinking about the kind of contact that's happened and how it specifically relates to expeditions as we talk about today. It's because there is this shift in the late 1700s with expeditions, right? You've got all these foreigners. You've also got Pacific Islanders that are all moving all over the seas, traversing it, right? At a certain point, you get a lot more Westerners coming in. And a lot of it has to do with trade, commerce, wanting to take over new lands, right? There's a lot of discussion of empire that gets involved in here. But at the late 1700s, you kind of see this shift, and it's all wrapped up in politics and economics still. But you start to see this shift where there's an interest in sending ships out for the pursuit of knowledge, particularly useful knowledge, right? And science. And so you've got all these people, you've got the British, the French, Americans, everyone kind of flooding the region. But all of a sudden it shifts and the Pacific becomes this kind of scientific playground, essentially, right? Where everyone can go and extract, explore, discover, test out things. Darwin, wanting to understand how coral atolls formed. And so as I think about the legacy of expeditions, from my perspective, it's particularly interesting because I work in a museum. And so I am surrounded, right, by the stuff, the remnants of these expeditions, right? It's all around me. And so it makes me want to think about kind of the purpose of expeditions. Why are these things there? And so that's what I want us to ruminate on, right? What's the purpose of an expedition? Who designs that purpose? Who undertakes it? What are the impacts of those expeditions in real time when it's happening, but also afterwards? What are the implications of all that stuff that gets collected? And not just objects that we think of classically in museums, but also data, maps, notes, journals, letters, all these things, right? And so I want to kind of think about take deep dives upon, if you will, into these histories of these collections and reconnect them back to communities today, right? And find ways of kind of understanding the past and understanding today. So in the very brief time we have today, I wanted to kind of very quickly mention 3 historic expeditions that I think are really important that talk about how we get to where we are today. I'm going to guess that many of you in the audience probably know what the first one I'm going to mention, right? Late 1700s, Pacific Islands, explorer, Most people think of Captain Cook, of course. And so the reason I want to mention this briefly is because it's kind of this unique moment in time. It's a very well-studied, also controversial part of history. It's part of the age of discovery that many Pacific Islanders also consider to be an age of genocide. And so there's a lot that you can sort of look into that. But what I want to talk about is the fact that this represents this shift from trade, from commerce to science, right? So we've got this ship gets sent out by the British government and the Society of Science out there to look at the transit of Venus, right? To look at this astrological unique phenomenon happening in Tahiti, and also to search for the southern continent and to make all these observations. So what this meant is instead of having a ship that's full of sailors that are uneducated perhaps and captains and shipmates, you would also actually get the chance to have scientists on board. This is one of the very first times you see scientists as well as artists that are put on board. There's actually even musicians that are put on board with like French horns and flutes and things. And the unique thing that happens on this voyage is you actually get Pacific Islanders themselves that come on board, right? So the most famous one that people think of is Tupaya, right? Who's this person from French Polynesia. We don't have any portraits of him that we know of, unfortunately. But all of a sudden, with his inclusion on the ship, he advised Captain Cook and all these other people, taught them, basically helped them on their voyages and taught them all this information, right? And this is one of the first times that you actually see indigenous knowledge about the Pacific being incorporated into Western stories about the Pacific. And that kind of shifts the ideas, right? And then the next expedition that I want to mention is the U.S. exploring expedition, because of course the United States wanted to be involved as well. And so they sent out ships in the 1830s. This was the largest voyage of discovery in the Western world. 6 ships, over 300 men. Note the word that I use there, which is men only. And its purpose was to go survey the Pacific, create maps, and bring all this data back. And of course, then again, you have scientists and artists on board, which is unique. But the reason I mention it is because the sheer volume of data and stuff that was brought back. There was so much that was brought in over 4 years, more than any other expedition ever, that they actually had to start shipping stuff to Washington, D.C. They couldn't contain it all in the ships. And so Washington, D.C. actually didn't even have enough room for this stuff. And so they decided to create a national museum, and that's the Smithsonian. And that directly comes from that expedition. And that's also the origin of government-funded science, which leads to a whole slew of them. The government really starts becoming involved in science and expeditions. And that leads to the last expedition I want to mention, which is the U.S. Fish Commission, which might ring bells for some people, right? So you've got, in the early 1800s, the government decides to create this Fish Commission because they want to continue westward expansion into the Pacific Ocean and see what kind of fish and other materials can be exploited. Now, this is the world's first large research vessel. It's called the Albatross, specifically made for this purpose, for scientific research. So there's laboratories, there's all these new technologies. They do bathymetric soundings, they dredge the depths of the ocean, and they also bring back a ton of material. And most people say that from a Western science perspective, that this expedition brings back more knowledge about the ocean than any other expedition and vessel. And so basically you've got the legacy of these 3 ships, right? Where you're bringing in artists and scientists, you're actually bringing government funded things, you're bringing back all this stuff. You've got ships that are becoming laboratories. And the last thing I want to conclude with is to think about that stuff and that data that we come back with, right? Many of us think of museums and the objects. But you have all this material of data and ship logs and letters and everything. And what happens with it? I think we need to think about who created it, what was the purpose, what happens to it afterwards. Because think about today, a lot of our understandings of the world were created and formulated by these scientists, right? And there's a lot of biases involved with that information. And so what we have to think about is the afterlives of this material, because it's still being researched today. Just a few years ago, Joshua Drew did this very fascinating research project on shark's teeth and looked at museum collections, like a sword from Kiribati, to actually determine historic shark populations. And so it's really important that we start to think about that data and the stuff that is collected and what happens to it. And so There's so much more I can say. I love this topic. It's such a passion of mine, but I really want to take us shifting over to kind of the next phase of expeditions with that historic nugget in mind. So.
Wow. Wow. Thank you so much, Ingrid. That was amazing. We're going to follow up with questions after we hear from each of the speakers. But before we hear from our next incredible speaker, I just want to say thank you to everyone from all over the world that's tuning in right now. Austria, South Africa, India, Cameroon. I mean, the list goes on and on. It's amazing. And we've had some really interesting responses. I'd like to, to the original question about what our listeners would bring on board their expedition. I'm going to read this one real quickly. I would take my spirit, clear, empty, and free, so I could receive what I otherwise would not anywhere else. You have to actually experience being out at sea to know the meaning of this. It's beautiful. Thank you so much for your responses. Keep them coming. So our next guest is someone I greatly admire and someone who's paving the way forward for women in the field of exploration. We heard from Ingrid about these expeditions that were entirely men, leaving out half the population. So Allison is Ocean Exploration Trust's very own Chief Operating Officer. And it's always such a privilege to be on the Nautilus with you, Allison.
You too, Jenny.
She leads the development and management of OET's ocean exploration and outreach activities and teams. She pulls from a diverse background of science, education, and extensive seagoing experience to engage the science community, students, and the public in telepresence-enabled expeditions aboard the Trust exploration vessel Nautilus, which we're on right now. Since 2006, she's led or participated in 50+ expeditions, utilizing a variety of deep sea technologies and submersibles in the Eastern, North, and South Pacific Ocean, Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of California, Caribbean Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea. Wow. So Allison, how are you today?
Great.
Wonderful. So you and I have something in common. We're both from Tennessee. So tell me the story of the girl that grew up in a landlocked state and how you ended up becoming the woman at the helm of the Ocean Exploration Trust.
Sure, Jenny. Well, I think like all of us on board the ship and probably all of you listening, it was certainly not a linear path that got me here. So yes, I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, so pretty far from the ocean. It was at least a 7-hour drive to the closest coastline. But I always kind of had exploration and education as my guiding North Stars. It's just something I've always had ingrained in my life. And my brother and I, when we were very little, my parents were the parents that had the National Geographic magazines full, like a bookcase full of them. So we would pore over the pictures. We probably weren't old enough to like fully read all of the articles, but we'd flip through the pictures and really find a lot of inspiration in those. And that kind of seeded some curiosity, and we were fortunate to live in an area that we had like a lot of woods and creeks and a lot of just nature to explore in our backyard. And so we did that. You know, we'd go and turn over rocks. I'd look for crawfish and explore the woods behind us, and we would always go with our Kodak flash camera and pretend that we were going to be National Geographic photographers. So just kind of a fun experience, kind of full circle now that we're on an expedition with National Geographic and being a National Geographic explorer now. It's awesome. So yeah, I've always had that kind of curiosity, but I also, my childhood dream was to be a teacher. I was always planning to be a teacher. And so those two have always been a part of me. And I think, you know, I found little snippets here and there of exposure to the ocean, and every time that passion for it just grew and grew and grew. And so I carried my passion for education through, and, you know, I went through college and focused on marine science, but really studied to be a teacher. So I started a career as a high school science teacher. But I think I was in the classroom for a few years, and that adventurous kind of voice in my head got the best of me and said, you need to break out of these walls and do something a little bit different. So I was very fortunate to earn my way onto my first research expedition in the early 2000s. And it was at a very exciting time. Yeah, there's baby Allison. was at a very exciting time because a group of researchers, mostly from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, had just discovered the first known repeat volcanic eruption on the seafloor at the mid-ocean ridges. Volcanic activity on the seafloor is very hard to document because it's hard to get there and hard to be there. And so the hook was just really set in me at that time. And one of the things that I really loved, aside from the science and the excitement of the adventure, were all the people on the ship, and just the interdisciplinary nature of pulling together an expedition. It was just, I had never experienced anything like it in my life, and I knew that it was what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. So I continued to kind of chart a course forward and kind of pulling from the education side, but went back for science. And so went back and got my graduate degree in geology because I was in love with volcanoes at that point, having never taken a geology class. So got my master's in geology, and yeah, through a couple of different career steps, ended up at Ocean Exploration Trust to build up the education programs, and eventually I became the chief operating officer.
Wow, you're just amazing. Yeah. So you've been at this for some years now. How many years would you say?
Almost 20, I guess.
Oh my God, yeah. That's amazing. That's so amazing. So over the course of that time, you've seen a lot of changes, right? So particularly changes in terms of the representation of women. Can you talk about that a little bit? How have you seen things change?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I started almost 20 years ago, it was largely male dominated, but we were starting, to see a lot more women on the ship. I mean, but look at our panel now, right? I mean, it's all women, which is fantastic. But I've been really fortunate to just kind of witness, the immersion of a lot more or equal representation, gender representation on board. But I would say, while we're seeing that, there is a ton of work for the oceanographic and the science community to do still, to make these experiences more equitable and more accessible to everyone, because we're not going to do the work correctly if we don't have everyone involved. And so, moving forward, I think it's really important that we're creating spaces, that we're co-creating expeditions with local and indigenous groups where we're going in to explore. And so that's a lot of the work that we've been doing with Ocean Exploration Trust and now National Geographic, to really expand how we approach expeditions in a much more ethical way.
Oh, that's just amazing, and we've really seen that on this expedition. This is very much a a new adventure for so many of us, having National Geographic explorers aboard, people like Elizabeth, Lindsay, with just this incredible knowledge of the area and of Pacific voyaging. It's just to me, it feels, I'm just a storyteller, a communicator on board, but it's just such an exciting thing to be a part of, and to see the future and the path forward for exploration and expeditions. And I'm just so grateful to be here with you all. So Allison, we're going to follow up with you with some more questions a little bit later on. To our audience out there, please keep your questions coming. You're amazing. We have such an amazing topic today. Keep on sending your answers. What would you bring on your expedition? So I want to get to our next guest. We have another inspiring woman who is also sitting here with me today. And her name is Dr. Elizabeth Lindsay. I know a lot of you are here to see her speak today, which is so exciting. She is National Geographic's first Polynesian explorer and female fellow. It's just incredible. She is an expert in cultural intelligence and ethnomimicry, studying native systems to develop sustainable solutions. Her firsthand accounts from some of the world's most valuable regions are helping reshape global perspectives on conservation and leadership. She leverages state-of-the-art technologies to address some of today's most critical environmental and cultural challenges. Her accomplishments are many, so I'll just name a few here. She's the recipient of the United Nations Visionary Award and has served on the boards of global organizations, including the Tibet Fund for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and UN ambassadors on behalf of environmental refugees. Mentored and and revered by Master Navigator Pius Mao Pi Lung. Yes.
Yes.
Elizabeth earned a PhD in cultural anthropology with a specialization in ethno-navigation, which means cultural navigation. She has established scholarships for women and children in the East, in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Just incredible work. So Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here today. Tell me a bit about yourself and how you got here.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to, and it's such a pleasure to be with all of you today. And to all of you who are joining us, I just want to start by saying this. We are all explorers, regardless of your landscape or your seascape. Everything we do in terms of our learning and our growing allows us to make discoveries. And in that way, we are the future of exploration. And I'll tell you just a bit about my journey because it was incredibly humble. And I had no idea that someday I would be sitting here on the Nautilus with these extraordinary women, talking to you about our experiences and how we became explorers and how every voice matters and every life counts. So I grew up in a small plantation community where I was raised by elders while my parents worked. And what these elders said is someday the world will be in trouble and it will take the wisdom from the far edges of the earth to return the world to balance. And they were very specific in their description of what they predicted would happen, but they saw flooding and natural disasters and many of the things that we're experiencing today. And they said this, it will take all of us. It will take all of us and all of us together globally to return the world to balance and to make this world better for present and future generations. And so I've been really encouraged, even though it was humbling and it seemed audacious that a girl from a plantation town would one day travel the world and listen to the voices of cultures that had so much wisdom in them, and to promise these cultures that I would bring back their wisdom and share it with the world. And I believe that that's incumbent upon all of us to go back to our families and our elders and to the environment and really listen deeply to the wisdom that's encoded in all of it, and then share it with your community, share it with everyone you can. This is how the world will change. I was fortunate enough to have been a student of a great navigator. His name, as Jenny was saying, is Pius Mao Piailug. And Mao, when we see him in this image of nighttime lessons underneath a blanket of stars, and how he would teach by listening to the winds and the rains, and how he taught many of us. I was just one of his students, but some of our great next generation of navigators were all of his students, and we're incredibly blessed. And what Mao taught us is that in order to navigate, you must love the ocean. You must love the elements in order to really understand them deeply and understand the information that they're providing for us so that we can gain our bearings and navigate through life. And now if we could get to the next slide, I am so excited that we can now remember our cultural history. This is a picture of a fish pond on Oahu. And these fish ponds in the 1700s could provide up to 2 million pounds of food for our population in Hawaii. And when the Hawaiian Islands were colonized by the United States, all of these fish ponds fell into disrepair. And now I'm very excited because the people of Hawaii are revitalizing these ponds because they recognize the intelligence, the cultural intelligence that's here in the islands, and applying that, which becomes our ethnomimicry, where we mimic like biomimicry. We learn and are inspired by the intelligence of the past, so we don't have to recreate the wheel. And throughout the world, there are many cultures. If we just look a little bit into their history and the cultural intelligence that exists there, we're finding answers to water harvesting and answers that that provide us with food solutions and food security. And I'm just grateful to be a part of this incredible journey. Now, lastly, what I wanted to share with you is that when I came back from Sadawal with all of these recordings of my mentor, and knowing that they were passing away and this could be lost, I started to look for a place that I could house this information safely so that it could be kept for their future generations and share it with the world. And I couldn't find a place for that. And so recently, together with some brilliant technologists, we are creating a platform called Earth One. And Earth One will be a digital archive for all of the world's cultural and environmental information, so that these cultures will have held in trust for their descendants all of the knowledge and the recordings of these voices and the chants and prayers and wisdom that's carried forth that otherwise would go unheard. You know, the voice of my mentor, Mao, I'm so excited that his chants will live on for his future generations and for all of us. And so we're at the very beginning stages of building this platform, but someday all of your stories will be able to be carried there. And that's important because no one should be left behind. Every single voice and every single story matters in this tapestry of humanity. And I cannot stress that more. So thank you very much for having me as part of this conversation.
Oh, just so beautiful, Elizabeth. I wanted to read a comment from a listener. Thank you so much for doing the streams and making it possible to follow along at home. It's my dream. This amazing work is their dream, and they're so happy that they can join in this way. Yeah, I mean, just amazing. So I'm so glad to have you all out there tuning in. Elizabeth, you know, spending this week with you has just been incredible. I've learned so much. All of us have. And you were telling me, or you were telling us a story of a site nearby that you know, it had some stones situated in such a way where there were where knowledge, you were talking about the knowledge that was passed along from navigators,
Yes.
set up in this circle, and it just blew my mind. Can you tell our audience that story? Would you mind?
I'd be so happy to. And I encourage all of those that are joining us to please follow the Nautilus. This is the research and the science and the cultural inclusion that's happening here is very exciting. So we're going north on the Big Island along the coast, and there is a part of this coastline called Mahukona. Mahukona it's home to the only navigational temple or heiau that we're aware of currently on the Big Island. There may be more, but at the moment, this is the only one that we know of that's documented. It was also the basis for my doctoral dissertation. But my teacher Mao would take me there, and there are upright stones that are very similar to the stones in Easter Island, except that they're much smaller and the faces are not as pronounced. And my teacher, being a master navigator, went to point these stones out, and he said, this comes from Samoa and this comes from Rarotonga. And I said, how do you know that? How do you know this knowledge? And he said, because at certain times of the year, these upright stones cast their shadows back to their home islands. So these navigators that placed this in this temple hundreds of years earlier were basically laying a code. It was their language to future navigators. And can you imagine if the stories that you have can carry forth in that way to future generations, where you can share your knowledge and wisdom with others, and that those that are not even yet born yet will someday hear your stories, and it will help pave the way for them.
That's just such an amazing story. I mean, it's amazing how much we have to learn from the past, you know, and how much we can learn from each other and engage with each other. I mean, how much work there is to do, and how exciting the expeditions of the future are going to be. So reflecting on your experiences and the knowledge that has been passed down to you as a Hawaiian navigator, a student of the world's cultures, and an explorer, what do you envision for the future of expeditions and exploration?
That's a beautiful question. Thank you. What I envision, and it has always been my prayer, and Ingrid spoke to this at the beginning of this session, is that there were biases constructed in the narratives that we were taught growing up basically came from one perspective. What I see as the future of exploration is that there will be many more voices, that we will be much more diverse and inclusive than ever before, and that these stories and cultural science, we often don't think of culture and its science and its innovation and technology. But as an anthropologist and also as a native Hawaiian, I see that these cultures, that their science is as sophisticated as any science I've ever seen, and that the people of their lands are among the greatest environmentalists I've ever known. So I see the future of exploration as being one that's incredibly inclusive, and that layers both cultural science with the science that we value with rigorous scholarship, and also with indigenous technologies coupled with state-of-the-art technologies.
That's really beautiful.
That's such a
And I'm just was going to jump in, Jenny, to say,
yes, please do.
To add on to that, I love what you said, and I want to tie it into kind of collections that are in museums today, which were collected under these totally different contexts, right? But it's really magical to watch people from various communities come back and interact with these materials, and kind of the memories that can flood up just by holding and seeing and touching something from the past, that maybe it kind of unlocks sometimes knowledge and memory that's embedded in those stones that you spoke of, or other objects, right? There's just something that comes forward, and that's where I really see museums as being able to kind of be part of that process, right? Of helping to bring that knowledge
Thank you, Ingrid,
forward.
for saying that, because I believe that going forward we will have living museums where it becomes much more immersive, and then we can bring all of that together. All of the data that you were talking about, we can hold in platforms like Earth One, and suddenly it becomes incredibly rich.
Just amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. It's just incredible. I do want to acknowledge that we have another ocean explorer and an inspiring woman who's here with us today, and happens to be sitting right in the next room, Megan Cook. I'm going to switch over to her here. So as many of you probably know, Megan is the Director of Outreach and Education for the Ocean Exploration Trust. And since 2013, she's participated in and overseen the organization's effort to educate and inspire the world in all the work aboard Nautilus. It's incredibly important work, and she does it so well. This is no easy feat, but I'd argue the work is absolutely essential, both for the organization and for educating the world about the important work taking place on the Nautilus. So Megan, a question for you. How have you seen expeditions change over your many years at sea, and how would you like to see outreach and education play an even bigger role in the expeditions of the future?
Wow, Jen, great question. I think what comes to mind first for me, thank you for that lovely introduction, and that is the work of so many people and so many teams that have been here. And I think it's one of the really special things about Nautilus, that we have grown a culture aboard the ship, that the vessel is constantly a place of teaching and learning, that we recognize that while we bring brand new people to see every expedition, first time offshore, our applications are open for our internships and fellowships now, if you'd like to be one of those people. And they work directly alongside people who have decades of experience or generations of knowledge about our ocean, and yet everyone has something to share and contribute. And that's the joy of that, is that culture that we all can participate and we all can learn from one another. that has grown on Nautilus. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens through intention. And our audiences all over the world, our fellow explorers, have been a big part of that by contributing their curiosity, by whether it's social media, live events like this, our live streams, our public events, the data that lives around the world, engaging with that, being part of that. So I really see so much possibility in the future of education and outreach because of the technologies that we have, and also because of the urgency of this time. Right? We have a great opportunity to bring more people into the conversation, to point the spotlight of where we learn and who we learn from and what knowledges we elevate. So it's so exciting to be able to give a glimpse into the realm of the deep sea or the shallow ocean, as we are this week, and to invite people to ask their own questions and to be part of that, and to get to meet the inspiring people who do this work in this way and inspire them to go out and be explorers in their own context, right? The ocean has never needed us more. Indigenous people have always known that deep connection to the ocean. So we all can be learners from them and create layers of knowledge, different kinds of knowledge, different experiences with the ocean that we all can share to bring the world along towards those solutions. Thanks, Jenny.
Wow, thank you, Megan. That was such a great answer. I would expect no less.
Exactly. And Megan said something that really sparked a thought for me. So thank you, Megan. It's about the urgency. What we know is that 96% of the world's population, 96% of the world's languages are spoken by just 3% of the world's population. And that half of our 7,100 languages that currently exist will be gone. They'll become extinct. They're predicted to become extinct by the end of the year, and or at the end of the century. And what that means is that all of the knowledge and the answers and the solutions that are encoded in these languages are being threatened to be lost. And that's really an urgent issue for many cultures, because as an anthropologist, I want to make sure that we are able to record this knowledge before it's forgotten, and that we will not lose the answers to some of the solutions that we are seeking right now. And so this loss of, someone once said to me that when an elder dies, a library of knowledge is lost. And what I believe is that libraries are ablaze around the world. So what I'd like to invite our audience to do is to start recording the stories within your families and within your communities, and go into nature and start recording what you can observe, and really become a very active part of this recordation, this history that needs to be compiled right now.
Oh, just beautiful. You know, it strikes me, you were talking about languages, and another thing you were mentioning this week that I remember you talking about is that so much knowledge is embedded in language itself.
Yes.
Particularly knowledge about navigation. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I'd be happy to. So we know that that language of every culture is the cornerstone of a culture, and that when a language starts to fade, the culture is threatened by it. And with my mentor, when I went back to Sadawal, they chanted 15-foot swells to a flat ocean so that the crew and I could come ashore. And as far-fetched as that sounds, if it weren't for the fact that I witnessed and experienced coming ashore, after we kept getting weather reports coming in from Guam saying that they couldn't get the ship close to the island, it would be hard for me to understand. And once I got to the island where the last few Palu, these navigational priests, lived, and watched what they did, they're mystic navigator priests, and they were able to, they talked about chanting typhoons to calm the storms when they were out at sea. And they would chant, and the whales would come and escort their vessels. And growing up with my elders and the things that I watched them do, I only know that it's a privilege to bear witness to the kind of understanding that we are intimately connected to the natural world. We are almost, these cultures understand that nature is our family. We belong to nature and nature belongs to us. And there is a beautiful, Brian Scary said something wonderful. We cannot protect what we don't love. So for us to really cultivate a deep and abiding relationship with the natural world allows us to protect these, all of these elements. And the same is true of culture. As we love humanity, we're able to protect it better.
And I think being out here with you has been so inspiring. And one of the things that I really take away is just, you know, how you observe things, you know, and how you take it all in the moment and observe. And I think that that is so important for expeditions of the future, you know, that have traditionally come at something with just Western science approach. You know, I think that's where we really have to change things and come in and make sure that we're weaving in those observations and that cultural knowledge. And so I just think it's really powerful to have that that presence here. And so
thank you so much. I watched it from my teachers, and so it's to them that I want to give the credit to. But when we really start to understand, this is something interesting. The word in Hawaiian for tree is the same word in Hawaiian for teacher. And it's just one example of how language demonstrates to us all of the wisdom. And I'm really excited by the people who are joining us from around the world, because there are many cultures with the same types of wisdom that inform so much. And I'd love to be a student all my life so that I can continue to travel the world and learn from all of you.
Oh, just beautiful. So this is a question for all of the panelists, and you know, also a word to the audience. Please write in your questions. We have some amazing panelists here. This is an incredible opportunity to ask them your questions, whatever you'd like. So you know, we've been talking about this question and this duty that we all have for increasing inclusivity in the field of exploration, but how do we do that? What do you think are our next steps? And this is a question that's open to all of you. Ingrid, you know, reflecting on the history of exploration, you are so studied in that history, particularly around the Pacific. Sort of reflecting on that history, what are your thoughts?
Gosh, well, I think as Elizabeth has so eloquently said, I think a lot of that is letting other people's voices contribute to these stories. I think that's how we have to move forward. And so for me, my responsibility as someone who stewards material culture, I have to connect these things back to Indigenous communities and let them speak to them in their own voices. And like Elizabeth is saying, pulling all that information together and sharing it. I think that's the only way forward, very simply, is to listen to each other, share, provide access, and listen to each other.
That's really beautifully spoken. And Ingrid, at the very top of the show, you acknowledged where you were and the people who had lived there. And I think that acknowledgement is the first step in. You know, in Hawaii, we're taught when you come to someone's home, you take off your shoes. It's metaphoric. I never travel to a land that is not my homeland or where I'm arriving at for the first time without asking quietly permission to be there. It's my way of taking off my shoes before I enter someone's home, because this is their homeland. So I love the fact that you did that right at the very top. And that degree of sensitivity and acknowledgement allows everyone, because oftentimes it's been my experience growing up in Hawaii that people would come in and they were very extractive in the way they gathered information, and then they left. And we were never a part of that, but we gave our most precious, our most precious knowledge, which for many of these cultures is all they have. And there was no degree of any reciprocity or even consideration of reciprocity. So it's really important to me that we right that vessel, that we course correct in that way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's interesting because as I know, one of the questions that we started out with and asking the audience, and I'd love to hear more about what people would bring if they were going on an expedition. But when I saw that question, I thought about it, and it's easy to say, coconut, because, it's the most amazing thing on earth, or pen and paper or something, right? But then as I thought about it more and thinking about that reciprocity, as an anthropologist, one of the largest things I've come across is that extraction, and not just of minerals and wood, but of knowledge. And so I think what I would bring with me if I was going on an expedition is gifts. I would bring tons of gifts to at least try and right that imbalance, right? And I think that's really important. So I appreciate you kind of highlighting that imbalance and the need for reciprocity, that we're not just taking data out of these places and knowledge, but we need to sort of share in that process, right?
Go ahead,
I'm just going to build on that a little bit. And, in terms of like, how do we do it, which, is what you asked. And, I think it's, in order to share and co-develop and co-implement, it takes time, it takes trust, it takes relationships, right? And so I think, that recognizing that you have to give the space, that time, to build that trust and those relationships is really critical.
And OET has done such a beautiful job by bringing in the elders of Hawaii and listening to them deeply and being very respectful. And this is critical to build trust with any culture. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, I want to continue this part of the conversation, but quickly, we had a comment from the audience. There's a question: can I access and share this presentation with others? Absolutely. This is going to be this is being recorded and will be available on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. No, I don't know. No, not Instagram. But it'll be available for anyone to share and watch whenever you like. So please do and share this widely. This is a very important conversation that we're having here. I think it's probably just the beginning of these important conversations. So please share widely. Let's see. We have another great comment here. We will never achieve inclusivity as long as there are no jobs in this field. Available resources stop once you're no longer a student. We are losing a generation of researchers.
Very
interesting.
Very interesting.
Well, and I think that's, that's certainly speaks to one of the things that, the community really needs to come together and do is, there's not one single pathway into a career in marine science. And so I think ensuring that there are opportunities for students, but there's also opportunities for young professionals of all backgrounds. And so that's certainly something that all of us need to do better at.
That's a very good point, Allison. And I also want to, advocate here for storytelling as a path forward, for many people on expeditions like this. It's what I do. It's what, Megan Cook does so well. Storytelling, even if you don't want to be a scientist, do the bench science and collect the samples and whatnot. Storytelling is so necessary in this work because you are the liaison between the work that happens and the public, you all. So how else is the world going to know about this incredible work? So, I would advocate those of you out there who love to tell stories, whether it be with your words or with your images, or your art. That is a way to be involved with this work.
And I'd love to add to that, please.
Yeah.
So what's really wonderful is that stories are humanity's DNA. They live in us. And all of us are natural storytellers. We sometimes forget that. And I remember an elder saying, the story is the medicine for the world. It will heal the world. And the storyteller is the shaman. And so when we think of both the privilege and the responsibility we bear to tell these stories, because if you don't tell your stories, who will then do that? There's one more proverb that has always stayed with me, and it's this: until the lion or the lioness tells his or her story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. And so we must remember that if we are not the storytellers of our stories, someone else may do that and may not get it right.
Beautiful. So we're coming up on the hour here. There is one last thing that I'd like to talk about here because it's been a really important theme on this cruise. So we have a team that's overseeing a project throughout the series of exploration or expeditions. And it's on data sovereignty. The idea being that, thinking about who owns the data that's collected, and how it's used. I was wondering, what are your thoughts on this? Ingrid, you were kind of talking about it a little bit earlier. How are these collection shares? Who owns the data, and why is data powerful? Why are data and collections powerful?
Sure. Well, just from a historical perspective, you have to think about how all of this information was used really malevolently in many cases, right? A lot of the information, the mapping and the records, sort of fed information for the extraction of a lot of natural resources, the locations of things and the value of things, but also for cultures and peoples. A lot of the information that was written about many indigenous peoples, particularly in the Pacific, were used for genocide, to kind of spread racist ideas. So we have to be very careful. And a lot of those things continue to this day, right? So information continues to be used in malevolent ways. So I think we have a great responsibility that while we are collecting things, to think about how they could be used in the future. So at the museum, at least, we think about this very carefully when people reach out and try and access things, is wondering how it can be used. And it's very we can talk about this for hours. It's very complicated, but I'd love to hear, Elizabeth, kind of how you have approached this.
Yeah.
I'd really be very happy to talk about it, because having grown up and watched people come in and record the elders that raised me, and historically what's happened, what we're doing with Earth One is, and what I've always done is, with every culture I've gone to, I've always promised them that, and this is my commitment that has been from day one and always, is that this recordation is for the culture. They inform and direct how it should be used, and what I always intend to do is hold it in trust for them, and they determine how they would like it to be used. Interestingly, what every elder has said to me is the world is in trouble and needs this wisdom, so please share it. And they've been incredibly generous. But I always understand that for their future generations, I want to make sure that their voices are never lost or forgotten.
What do you have any last
Sure.
comments?
Yeah, I think data sovereignty is essential to
Mhm.
everything that we do, and especially as we're working out here in the Pacific. I think the data itself is one thing, but it's defining what data is collected up front and in the beginning is really essential, and how you're going to co-interpret that data, and what you're doing with it. So I think it's not just the end product, it's the process.
Yeah. And I encourage all of you out there to look into the work of Keolu Fox and Grace Young,
Yes.
Who are exploring this and thinking about it along this series of expeditions. It's really fascinating.
Yeah. And they really use the term data trust, and it's an important distinction between data sovereignty and data trust. And Keolu is incredibly sensitive to the data they're collecting regarding the indigenous people.
Yeah. Yeah, wonderful. So we are right up against the hour, and I wish we could continue this conversation. It's just fascinating and wonderful to be here with you all. We've learned so much from first Ingrid about the history of expeditions, from Allison about this new world we're living in, where women are at the helm of the expeditions of the future, and finally from Elizabeth about dreaming of the possibilities. I'm just so inspired by all of you, and just honored to be here. So with that, I will turn it over to Megan, who I'm also very honored to be here with. I'm sorry I didn't mention you. I'll pass it over to you, Megan. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you everyone for contributing your knowledge and all of your questions coming in around the world. You all are also part of the future of exploration and expeditions, and we are just so pleased to be able to share this time and conversation with you. What's coming up next from Nautilus will be another live panel on Tuesday, October 11th. Right now, a project team on board is studying marine microplastic pollution, studying our own impacts on the ocean using a combination of marine science and forensic science. So tune in on Tuesday with us for a conversation about CSI for the oceans and how we can all learn to be part of solutions to how we impact and care for our ocean there. This program will be on all of our social media channels and Nautilus Live. So until then, tune in, be with us on this exploration, and check out behind the scenes research on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and of course on Nautilus Live. Aloha, everyone. See you again soon.